Hello and welcome to 1 Week Critiques, the interview series, episode 12. This week we are talking with fellow 1 Week Critique editor, Adam al-Sirgany. Welcome, Adam.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Now, besides writing poetry, prose, editing various endeavors, and busking on the corners with your saxophone, what should people know about you?
Maybe the hardest question of the night. Well, as you know, several people, as we've started the interview series and have been engaging folks with 1 Week Critique, have been interested in sort of who we are. So one of the reasons that we really wanted to put some editor work out there was to introduce ourselves. I have had an eclectic background, which has been primarily framed by literature. Probably the most relevant thing for anyone to know about me in general, but especially for the pieces we're going to talk about today, is I grew up in Northwest Illinois / Southwest Wisconsin, right where Illinois, Wisconsin, and Iowa meet, right on the edge of what's called the Driftless, where the last ice age didn't flatten out the Midwest. And I was the son of a elementary school principal, later superintendent, and my father was a kind of vagabondy Egyptian jewelry designer who stumbled into the Midwest. And so a lot of my work has engaged the Midwest and its particular strangenesses, but also the odd and incompatible ways in which the Midwest and Middle East occasionally run into each other. But yeah, I think that's probably the relevant information for this evening. But I'm a private person who's an open book if you ask me questions, so I invite anyone to follow up anytime they want, and I'll expand excessively.
So you're saying you're in the middle, whether it's east or west?
Every time.
All right. Well, we know where you stand on sandwiches. All right. So the piece we're going to discuss originally was written as a poem before you transformed it to prose. Would you read that initial draft entitled 24 October?
24 October for Devin Mickle. Dissipating difference between gauze and skin, skin and rib, and whatever seeps from under, above, beneath. I am not a doctor, not able to witness pictures other than in Pythagorean boxes, pixels yay big by yay. Reading Washington Post, revisiting Afghanistan as if land was imagined. Gulliver, parajumpers, sharing acronym with nightgowns from Persian leg wear, nepenthe of dark-skinned presidents and news cycles concerned with so-called Islam, worshipping you because never having seen your body, the engine clicking of jet hearse on tarmac, the engine clicking of jet hearse on tarmac, 0, the set of all letters to Gutenberg by Socrates regarding the matter of X, the set of all writings on Socrates by Plato, now lost to time, this presupposition, time, that movement, speed, a relation to distance, but if still, then seconds different. From a watch on the plane, no access of here, but same, on point, not having traveled, certainly, always thinking I remembered your dying, a means to thinking I witnessed you live.
Thank you. This poem's style seems more indebted to Pollock's drip paintings, I would say, than someone like Grant Wood's American Gothic. Yet, to an extent, it is the reverse in your prose. Do you think your approaches to genre differ? And can you talk about how you moved from poetry to prose?
Yeah. This is a good multi-part question, and one that I'm excited about, not only because it gives me an opportunity to soapbox on the differences between genres or the non-differences between genres, but also I think because at the particular time that I drafted that first poem, um, I had been engaging for the first time, I think, really seriously in a long time um, with visual art, and I had actually been notably obsessed with Hieronymus Bosch at that time, who I think probably had a big influence on Grant Wood in terms of the kind of comic intensity um, of, of painting. But I think one thing about my own mind, um, as a writer, regardless, and as a thinker, and obviously as a talker, is that it's a little bit constellary. I think my mind turns on um, a little bit, um, like if you're outside and you look up and you see a single star, and you go and you look at that star, by the time you've kind of like fixed your eyes on that star, there are usually three or four more stars there um, in the way, or the way that you like walk down the street and sort of watch several street lights come on at not quite the exact same time, but really close to each other. I think poetics really allows me to operate in those spaces of simultaneity quite a bit. There's a quote that John Coltrane has. I'm not going to get it perfectly, so I'm going to admit to paraphrasing now. In an interview where he talks about having a lot of ideas happen at once, and his sort of famous sheets of sound, um, for him, aren't one thought or some kind of intention to go further. It's just he's trying to express the many thoughts that he has, and they're coming so fast that he's kind of propulsing them out in what we call sheets of sound. Um, I think poetry can have that effect, especially when it's hyper condensed. You can see words and images rhyme. If you're looking at a sonnet, you can look at all of the end words of the sonnet and see how that rhyme pattern happens. You can see concrete shape in a different way that prose doesn't have, and has an opportunity to lay those things out in a much more immediate way, um, I think is what I'm looking to say. Um, so I think all of those things happen. I think poetry is also, it's a literary art that emerges out of the musicality of language, but also the images of language, which, by which I mean like all of the things that happen within the sensory world and how they translate into words, um, which are always kind of metaphors, right? Um, Prose, I think, doesn't require the same kind of music, and it only requires word images as the things that they are to function at its basic level. I think I'm a prose writer who's really obsessed with musicality and imagery, and so especially music drives a lot of the way that I'll write a sentence. But I understand myself in prose to be telling something like a story movement, which might include ideas that move back and forth, or uh, time senses that move back and forth differently. But I don't always experience poems in that same way. I think as I get older, I move increasingly towards something like prose poems where they start to enmesh. But if I were looking at someone that I think of as kind of pure prose, I'm thinking of something like Kafka, which I've never read in German, but in English translations is often pretty enough, but very kind of direct and frank and strange, and is built out of often pure just dialogue. um, for pages on end. And as I understand it, was Kafka at one point had actually made notes in his literary diaries about printing his novels essentially without paragraph breaks, but in really large font and really bold font, so that it would you could just process all of that dialogue moving through, um, in the kind of, he used a lot of legalese, especially in something like the trial. Um, and I think that prose can be that way, and it can engage the kind of dullness of language in that way. I think poetry too, I think it's a lot harder to do in those condensed spaces and to do some of the other things that poetry kind of emerges out of.
Have you read Laszlo Krasznahorkai? I'm sure that's not how you say his name.
I have no idea who
Okay.
that is.
I think some of his books remind me of that, the way the prose is just like a block for a long time. And like it has this kind of doubleness to it, where like there's the thing happening in the story, but then like there's the thing happening in your mind, because you're just like there.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
there's nowhere to go, outside of this block. There's not any white space. And I was thinking about, I read comic books, and I was thinking about, in comics they call that the gutter, for
Yeah.
whatever reason. So like you can have white gutters or black gutters. Those are usually the types of gutters you can have, and that will change based on, if the scene's set at night or during the day, or if the scene's darker versus more, positive. And so, like in that way, I think of, you know, your your own prose as kind of being interested in obfuscation. And um, while I say, uh, there is a difference between your poetry and prose, and that your prose to me in general is, I suppose, more direct. Like there is still this obfuscation that is prevalent. Um, I'm thinking of like putting things out of order, uh, or not exactly addressing a thing directly. Um, so you know, I was interested in what you think obfuscation allows that clarity lacks.
Yeah. Um, I think what obfuscation allows that clarity lacks is a really good question. Maybe such a good one that I'm gonna uh, slip around it and obfuscate it a bit myself. I think that, um, when I'm writing, I'm often not thinking about it as obfuscation. Um, and there are different ways in which I might obfuscate, um, which is a word that I realize I don't use often as it comes out of my mouth.
Same.
So I don't know if you've ever seen uh, like Rodchenko pictures, right? Like a Russian photographer, and a lot of them are really, um, they're captured at really strange angles, and they're often really banal objects or things that you would see every day. And I've often wondered to myself if that's just how Rodchenko saw the world, that he was constantly kind of crawling around spaces, or if, occasionally he caught that angle and it said something really important to him. In this case, right, like I think we'll end up talking about this a little bit later, so I won't belabor it, but this particular poem, I wrote originally, at least the earliest draft that I was able to find was in, um, 2014, which is about 5 years after one of my childhood best friends had been killed in Afghanistan. And I'd spent a lot of time thinking about that in different ways and grieving that in different ways. But it was an unusual death, and I encountered death in a lot of different ways. I grew up on a farm. My grandmother was a geriatric nurse. I knew a lot of older people. I knew a lot of people who had died, um, including, um, you know, other people who were my age. But one thing that was really unusual about Fuzzy's death, um, which is Devin Mickle's real name to me, is that Fuzzy's death was something that could be politicized. Um, and so I think the clear narrative that sort of emerged, not only locally in Stockton, Illinois, where I grew up, which is a fairly conservative space and is fairly proud of the fact that it has a lot of veterans, um, but also weirdly nationally, right? This was 2009, and there's a lot of uh, hope that Barack Obama would make certain kinds of changes in Afghanistan as he took office. This is not wildly far after the Bo Bergdahl incidents. And there, there was a lot of news that was still counting death tolls. And um, Fuzzy had happened to be in a unit that at that time had a photojournalist with them. And so, and another individual who was with him had survived the blast at near distance. And so there was um, a lot of reasons for that to emerge very briefly on a national stage and color the way in which my friend Fuzzy, who I had never seen in his uniform, uh, became PFC Devin Mickle, a kind of object of political interest. And the two of them disappeared together, um, and PFC Devin Mickle got to live on in some small way through websites that looked at military heroes, and through the way in which he was celebrated, and the way his name was going to make its way into reportage and all these kinds of ways of talking about him. But Devin was not going to, Fuzzy was not going to make it forward in the same kind of narrative way. And I think a lot of that obfuscation for me is, one, looking at something that was profoundly difficult for me to look at anyway, because I cared about this person who passed away. In general, I think I'm really terrified of exactly the kind of thing that Fuzzy's death was open to and had elements of in it, which was uh, simplistic answers to how and why something had happened, right? And I think the obfuscation gives me an opportunity to look at all the things that go into that, and not just say, um, my friend is a hero, or, this person died and I'm sad, which is true enough, but didn't answer the total thing for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that speaks to another quality that your prose takes, and that is digression. Um, do you think, what do you think drives your digression specifically? Like, I realize that the amount of information in the world and in any given event can be broken down in so many different ways, right? But like, what is it about digression specifically for you that drives some of your prose?
Yeah, I think maybe my uh, near pathological swimming thoughts, but I think also maybe I'm thinking about this because the original version, there are other versions of this poem, and almost all of them eliminate the the use of mathematical sets. but I think for me, it's a little bit like that, right? So when I'm looking at sort of, okay, why did my friend die, or how should I think about my friend dying? There's like a set of things that go into it. I think that operates a lot like actually to sort of the diptych structure itself, right? Like if you ever look at a Hieronymus Bosch, like usually they're triptychs and they're like these big panels of like all kinds of things going on. Like there's a lot of people and angels and things happening in the sky and kind of market things going on and hay wagons and all kinds of stuff. And any individual panel is sort of overwhelming with its abundance. And I think for me, I'm often trying to capture like, okay, what's in the set of X? Like what is in panel one that I need to understand? And so I think my digressions are often working off of that, right? Like a lot of my sentence structure was really formulated out of a very particular time in my late teens and early 20s where I would obsessively write out other people's sentences and like whole stories sometimes. And, two of the people I did that the most with would, William Faulkner, who has these incredible digressions that go on and tell internal stories and that give you information that sometimes is irritatingly necessary to the story, if you're not a hyper attentive reader on that level, but that also help bring to bear some real kind of specific pain and specific confusion that many of his characters are living in. And I think it deals with sometimes traumatic events and sometimes just like the banality of life and all of its weirdness. Gina Barrio is the other one who absolutely influenced the way my sentences are written and is sort of the person I think of as my like closest prose forebear. And I think her sentences aren't winding in the same way that mine are winding. They do have this kind of odd hypotactic sense where they will introduce an idea and often an adjective or some qualifying statement will be an afterthought, as if you need to know the basic thing and the like quality of the thing comes to you. And I think that feels real to me in terms of the way that I actually see the world, right? Like you see something like a dog and you go, that's a dog. And then you think afterwards, like that dog is brown, or that dog is, like some kind of Shiba Inu mix, or that dog is, bigger than my dog, or whatever it is. And I think some of it's that is like thing A, I've realized over time that in order to make sense of those kinds of sentences, and the kinds of qualifiers that those are, I really learned this a lot from John Updike, who, like, is a very clear person, right? Like, sort of most people who study fiction, or at least at one time, most people who study fiction got taught A&P, which is like a very straightforward narrative, and the sort of metaphors in the way of thinking, right? Like, he's a young man, he's sitting in an A&P, he's working at the A&P, and these girls come in scantily clad for the beach, and, indignant manager of the space, like, kicks them out, and he's looking at their cans, and like sort of makes an irrational decision to quit, for the sake of these girls who don't notice him at all. And that story is told very, as is much of Updike, but if you see Updike break that form, he often will tell you something important and factual or the subject of the sentence, and he'll digress, and then he'll come back briefly and punctuate that. And I don't know if that for him is an invitation to skip over all of the intermediary babble, or if that's a way of controlling the sentence and letting that digression live and the paragraph continue on, but I think it works both ways.
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of interesting things to parse here. Your utilization of long sentences that have a lot of punctuation generally push the thought beyond the possibility of a human breath, of literally saying the sentence without pausing to breathe. Now, obviously, punctuation, is there for the breath in a certain respect, but this kind of comes back to another thought I had is like, when you're talking about the mathematical sets, for example, where does the variable end? Or like, where does the digression end? Because, as you say, these things can spin out and spin out for, as long as the person writing or thinking can go. But it's like, it's a different, it causes a different reaction in a reader than, say, parataxis does, or the short sentence. And so, what do you think? Like, what are you thinking when you do these things within the work? Because it's not like you never use a short sentence, right? And taking into account your love of music, how does that play in as well? Because there's no way you can play the saxophone forever, without taking a breath. Yeah. Of course, I will say, it did bring up the thought of Tariq Trotter, better known as Black Thought for the Roots, who uses the continuous breath while he's rapping. And I don't know that I understand how that works, but in some respect, like, he is able to like push farther than you would think one would be able to push in, articulating sound.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that that's a really good way of putting that. I think actually, as you mentioned, I play several instruments, but my primary one is the saxophone. John Coltrane, who's probably influenced my musical thinking, but maybe all of my artistic thinking more than anyone, does do um, a lot of continuous breathing or circular breathing, right? Like, which is a didgeridoo technique, and like a lot of people will train with like straws. I've actually done this a lot. I'm terrible at it. But maybe it's ambition built out of my musical failures. But I think also that there are, I've listened to a lot of jazz music, less so rap, but quite a bit of rap in my life, and I'm really fascinated with these kind of continuous lines that manage to go beyond the expected extension. I think I like that feeling of like musically, like being driven and kind of starting to feel out of breath myself. And like, I think in the way that people get runner's highs, I get a little high like that. Sometimes even listening to like, there's this one Charlie Parker lick in this recording of Night in Tunisia that like goes on, and it's so fast and it happens in such a short period, but so many things happen that it like, every time I hear it, I'm like, yeah. I think I'm also like really aware that like that does need, right, like its own kinds of punctuation and up and down and crescendo and decrescendo. And so some of it's purely musical for me, right? Like, as long as I think the lick makes sense. So this story the story this emerges into is a diptych, is what I call it, and we can get into that later. But so it starts out describing the death of my great aunt, and it has the second paragraph has one very long sentence explicating something, and then it immediately dives into a fairly short, simple sentence. And I think that like, after I get out of breath in that way, like there's something about just the quality of flexing, or there being so much verbiage that I want that simple punctuation. I think within that also there are like not all things in a given set are equal, that I'm thinking out in this story a lot of things about my great aunt and the mysterious money that she left behind her. Um, and I'm thinking that out very much in relation to who she was as a person and the kind of appearance of simplicity and poverty that she had, but also the kind of contrasting opportunities that I, as someone in her family and a family that particularly valued education and so on and so on, had, as opposed to someone like Fuzzy, who in the second part of the diptych, I hope it becomes fairly clear that I think he's an interesting and thoughtful and intelligent young man whose opportunities were just different and whose way of thinking was different, often because of different kinds of exposure that emerge out of all of that. I think both things, the simple of this litany or the simple punctuation of this, is that one is it's musical, and two is it's musical with consideration to what kinds of questions am I actually asking within the story.
I think one thing that stands out to me about the quality of the length of sentences, or the length of sentences back to back, is that they ride the edge between anxiety and euphoria in a very strange way. Because like as a reader, like it's supposed to be like, and we can, that's a whole nother ballgame, but like a complete thought, right?
Yeah.
But but like, it's going on, it's going on, it's going on, and at some point, you're like, all right, where's this gonna like conclude? So like there's that anxiety. However, oftentimes like part of the fun is like going through that weaving and then like arriving somewhere, right? So that's what I mean by like this edge of anxiety and euphoria.
Yeah, I think that maybe a great description of my life, but I think there's a great David Foster Wallace sentence. I think it's in Oblivion, where like he describes this character as a child and he goes back and forth. And I think I get so much joy out of thinking he describes this person as like being a baby and like lifting his hand in some kind of like sort of protest sort of way while he takes a shit. And like it goes, and I think sometimes for me it's also, it is that like I get tense in the sentence, but something so funny or absurd happens in the sentence along the trip that I'm like willing to take it with him. And speaking of people who've been influential on my sentence writing, David Foster Wallace, obviously also someone who grew up in Illinois farm country and maybe had too much time to stare at corn and think out things long form.
All right, true. Let's not get into corn, because I think we both have far too much to say about corn that no one is interested in hearing. Another thing you're big on is history, but not just history, ancestry. Um, and I wondered why, or what you find important that you glom onto with these things. Um, I'm particularly thinking about like Gutenberg, Socrates, and Plato from the poem, or we'll look at part of the prose piece here in a minute, but there's the epigraph by Gertrude Stein. How do you see these particular things acting or being important on your work?
Yeah, I think that's a big, complicated question. Um, and nevertheless, I'm glad you asked it. Um, I think, you know, within the context of the poem, um, So I'm most of those historical figures, right? Pythagoras or Pythagorean boxes, for instance, right? Like kind of carry forward into pixels, um, which is a much more modern image. Um, but there is a time displacement in the way that Gutenberg, Socrates, and Plato are introduced, right? It's um, Socrates, because the time displacement can't happen, can't write to Gutenberg about what Plato has written about him, which is partly maybe just my sense of humor in the way that I enjoy the kind of sets, being within sets and not quite playing out. I think on a more like personal level, right? It is this like fantasy about, you know, for as much as I like to think about polyverses and multiverses and uh, infinite sets of possibility that there is, right? Like all of that in the poem relates to this watch on a plane, which is kind of an Einstein's relativity example that I can't quite actually get back in time, and so this one image of kind of, in this case, sitting in an airplane hangar and like waiting for my friend's body to come back, um, is this thing I can't quite escape in that time. There's something funny about memory that holds you in that place, right? That's true of my experience of that, where, right, like when Fuzzy's body was brought back, right, like a military jet flies in and the family sits in this airplane hangar and just welcomes it in. And I went with the family, and it's just this painful long sitting there. It's this like long extension of time to see a coffin come off of an airplane. And that kind of has haunted me for a long time, and it sticks with me in my mind. And I think memory is a little cruel that way. It doesn't always work in the ways that you would want it. Like I can't remember, like, you know, how to put together an engine, which would be terribly useful to me. But I spent a lot of time with people who put together engines, including, you know, Fuzzy at different times, and I just can't like hold that in my mind. But I can hold that. I think on a more historical level, I think at least in my experience, the Western world, whatever's left of the Western world, like a lot of the way that information passes from person to person, right? We thought X way, and now we have to get to Y way to correct the errors in X way often. And I think especially, or alternatively, right? Like I spend a lot of my day on a computer doing work. I get woken up in the morning by my telephone, which also uh, announces news stories to me and takes an algorithmic consideration of which news stories I poke, and then takes variables and then says like, okay, I'm going to give you more of these until it turns into kind of like extravagant thing. And my kind of way of fighting that of like, okay, I'm going to like watch Rachel Maddow, and immediately after I'm going to just like see what's happening on Fox News. Um, you know, like creating a polarity doesn't necessarily land right. Like I like to imagine I create a little homunculus of reasonable somewhere in there, which obviously isn't true. Um, and I think when I do get most reasonable, it's when I displace myself in context and look at larger and larger frameworks of how things become the way they become and the different kinds of ideas that shift from thing A to thing B. Um, I think often when we're in the present, we're taking whatever we liked immediately from the past and then trying to correct for whatever else we don't like about the past. And I think that the past has all these opportunities for things that I might like if I go back to, I don't know, I dig on Plato. He's not my favorite philosopher, But I think like thinking like, okay, Plato, and the only thing I can get out of Plato is that Plato was an idiot. Thank God for Aristotle. Like, oh man, like thank God for Thomas Aquinas. Like he really like took Aristotle. Like, what would we have done without the Catholic Church? You know, and then like thank God for Kant. That Catholic Church period we went through was a little childish. Like reason and you know, and like thank God for Nietzsche. What we really needed was some like will to power to get in our lives or whatever. Like that it doesn't all cancel out, right? Like there's something in there where all those viewpoints start to collectivize, and I think also like give me opportunities to see new viewpoints better, as opposed to just like looking for the viewpoint that fixes the things I dislike most. um, and I think I as an individual need that. um, I think literarily I also need that, right? Like I have all the respect in the world for George Orwell, but I think of like 1984 is a very like polemical book. um, and you know, I think Orwell had an agenda about what he wanted to convey there, as you know, like the kind of usual pair. Like Brave New World is a very polemical book. One of the sad ironies of both of those books is that they have all these incredibly intelligent things to say about avoiding the dehumanization of modern technology and drug use and totalitarianism and all of these things. And to do that, they have to turn their characters into these sort of like almost, you know, not automatons, but they're like, I mean, you and I have talked a lot about like Don Quixote, and like Don Quixote, he has one idea, but the way that Cervantes positions him against other people brings out this phenomenally strange character. Like over the course of like the 800 or 900 pages or whatever that book is, like in some ways, like, you know, Pancho and Quixote become these like, they're always sort of simple-minded, but they become these like wildly diverse characters. Or I was trying to sell you a while back on Hasek, and like the good soldier's fake is, you know, clinically feeble-minded, or whatever the term is in the translation you have, but like he's he's clinically feeble-minded in a way that develops into all kinds of strange thoughts and possibilities, which might have to do with his Czechness, which might have to do with just like the brutality of World War One, which might have to do with just like his particular way of thinking about the world. And it depends on the moment over time. And I think uh, the more complexity I can add, the more I can get myself away from fighting totalitarianism in my essays, or like being angry at something in particular, the more I can explore a world that feels real. And for me, that happens to be significantly denser than Cervantes, and way less funny. Um,
Well, I think one thing that's funny is that Cervantes is like playing with this idea of, right, the knight errant, and that the whole idea of armies and people wearing the same thing, the same uniform, is that they're expendable and replaceable. And yet that book is not replaceable. Like,
so
it's just not. Anyway, I don't want to digress too much on that. But speaking of viewpoints, would you read the first three paragraphs of the prose piece or final draft of this? Notably, we're not going to be looking at Devon or Fuzzy in this particular portion of it, because as you'll see by the title and as your description has told us, it's a diptych. But like, it is interesting to think about, you know, where this moved from the poem to this. So whenever you're ready, sir.
sure. A single charm is doubtful, a diptych. A single charm is doubtful. If the red is rose and there is a gate surrounding it, if inside is let in and there places change, then certainly something is upright. It is earnest. Gertrude Stein, Nothing Elegant. When I think of Dorothy, I worry I've already forgotten her. Sight the least sense of my memory, she felt like an old woman, thin-skinned and smelled of soda crackers. All I really have are aging words. In her diaries, or what diaries were collected and kept by her youngest sister, Rita, my grandmother and executor of her estate, Dorothy Yoan Smith logged daily from the time she was 35 until at 93 dementia began finally to disrupt her memory or the habit. Matters of secretarial importance, the places of her going, future appointments, books read, foods consumed, recipes tried, and their relative quality as regarded by her tongue. As far as anyone knew, she never cooked or baked anything, having only ever served house guests cold-cut sandwiches and raw baby carrots, and always having brought the same jello and pretzel dish to family gatherings and church potlucks alike. Having once done so, goes my mother's version, for a Christmas party in the 70s, and being thought so dear by all, the guests ate great plates of the stuff quickly, thinking she'd feel loved and the mess would be gone forever. Financial accounts, labeled with cryptic abbreviations and written out up to 28 a day as math problems, each done twice in neatly parallel rows on legal pads and sheets of graphing paper stapled to their pages. My first memory, the one that by date and detail I can to some degree verify, is of the farm auction. Dale, then 10 years gone, and Dorothy worn down from dusting chaff and corn pollen from the entryway, washing mold from the limestone foundation, climbing 3 flights to the attic to assure herself no one had been there since she had last, checking same, staring out from a south-facing window at some fellow from Coos Mall, driving his pickup through her drainage, picking soybeans and tasting them, who she did not recognize because, though her husband had not been an especially clever farmer, Dale Smith had relished having done work he could call his own. So the Smith's 80 acres, since Dale had purchased them from his father in 1942, had been tended by his hands only, his and those of his family, his father, his brother, Dorothy's 2 brothers-in-law, and their 7 sons, Dorothy and her sisters and their 5 daughters, whose work was not thought secondary, my grandfather would say, but so steady and constant that to speak of women's work, particularly the work of young women, would be like speaking of a rain you were standing in. The Smiths had no children of their own.
All right. So this project starts as you trying to come to terms with the death of a friend. How do you end up, deciding to contrast his death with your great aunt Dorothy?
Yeah, this is a good question. It's one that's tough. I think not only because it's personal, but because um, there's multiple answers. I think my big realization about trying to write about Fuzzy for the first time uh, was that I needed to get past looking at the death and the kind of drama of the death in order to process the death, but also in order to speak to myself about what that death and its dramas were. Um, I'm not the kind of writer who writes about everything that ever happens to me. Um, I think for me, this particular thing was something I needed to work through. It was also something I needed to work through intellectually because of the kinds of questions that it opened up to me um, about the spaces I grew up in, uh, about the politics of that time and the politics that I was finding myself engaged in, um, and and many other things. So I set out, having written this poem, I said to myself, what I'm going to do is I'm going to write about Fuzzy's life. And there were, in between that poem and this story, several horrific and gratefully disappeared handwritten attempts uh, at this story. And I think of it as a story because over time, some of the ways in which it started to frame itself involved getting rid of the idea of writing it without shaping the story or adding kinds of fiction to it, but also the realities both of who Fuzzy was and his death, but my great aunt and her death have oddities about them. And so late in this story, there's one sentence with a couple brief follow-up commentaries about Fuzzy dying, and it emerges out of an argument he's having with his high school girlfriend, who he later marries. And so I found that angular moment and put it down on the page and decided to write toward that angular moment. And for me, there were a lot of real world things to put into perspective. Not only that my aunt had died, and that is eventually the occasion for the character of myself and the character of Fuzzy to be arguing in a basement about nothing at all. We did argue in a basement and throw ledger pads at each other. There were other people there, and there's a refinement of that text. There's also, I think, there's a commentary at the end of the first diptych where my grandfather is trying to distinguish between what a story is and what a legend is. And that's a real thing that my grandfather tried to explain to me. My great aunt Dorothy was the first person who I had known who died and who wasn't sort of immediately remembered in terms of the narratives of her life, but rather the oddity of her life. And in the real world, when we cleaned out her house, not only were there actually igloo coolers of quarters and silver dollars in bankrolls, like appear in the story, there were also most of her wealth was kept in bearer bonds and wrapped in tinfoil and tucked in places like underneath her bed and in her cupboards and various other locations, which was a deeply, deeply weird thing. And so the story of that got around, and the oddity of that got around, and there really was this kind of odd reaction of her neighbors that was reminiscent of something like a normal farm sale, but was also much stranger and created new kinds of conversation about who should get that money and how they should get that money, and so on and so forth. And most of it ended up being left to the Catholic Church, and which meant a great deal to her. And but like, people have opinions around cash, and I had come over the years to realize, as I was thinking through this, sort of like, as I'd mentioned earlier, why I'm alive and I get to sit in a room and talk with you about the things that I've sat around and thought about and gone to school repeatedly to think about, come from all kinds of places. One is a financial privilege that Devin didn't have. I do have my last letter from him from boot camp, and he says to me, I think this is more or less a verbatim quote, it's great, I'm getting paid to work out and blow shit up. And he also goes on to elaborate what he always did about that, in which military recruiters often did, and they would come in very often in in that rural space where I grew up, repeatedly try to sign people up, that it's a way to get to go to college, right? Which many people in that space didn't have other opportunities to, or the same kinds of opportunities to, that you would if you grew up in the Chicago suburbs, the New York suburbs, or in New York proper, or many people in those spaces, right? Um, and so I think those were the kinds of questions that I was using to frame that, and I had to answer that for myself. And there are many things I allude to, like my grandparents sort of push for their children to be educated, um, that lend to those privileges and those positionings. But money was a big one. And so introducing both money and death early on gave me an opportunity to, and a death that was of natural causes at a ripe old age, gave me an opportunity to put those things in contrast, and also to think through the environment in which I was growing up in. And I think to, right, like to escape some of the kind of political conversations that I think avoid addressing the really big questions around, right, uh, like it or not, right, like a lot of this sort of situations in our lives are protected by sort of, American hegemonic military power. And many of the people who do the blue collar grunt work of maintaining that, um, don't do that because they're inherently evil people, or they just grow up in a different environment than most of the people who don't go into that, and who don't think that way. And so I think I was working through all of that. I needed a frame. Dorothy is a natural death in an old age. The money all gave me opportunities to then walk into the conversation about Devin and who he was, and contrast between us, in a framed way that would lead back coherently and kind of create that Hieronymus Bosch image, if you moved through all of it, that you might get the two panels into something like a coherent pairing.
Notably, you did mention the hayrack in Hieronymus Bosch, which I find hilarious, being Midwestern boy that you are. Um, I think we're going to end with this. A few things that kind of came up along the way that I was thinking about that kind of, I don't know, speak to this question a little bit are this idea that, you know, you're interested in having these frames, particularly for this story, um, right, with Dorothy and Fuzzy. The use of diptych, right? Um, you also have said that you feel most reasonable when you displace yourself. And so here we've got writing of two different genres, or possibly three. We've got different stories. We've got different things that clearly you've been thinking about during this time. And you also mentioned, this idea that, um, you don't want the easy answer per se, or you don't want um, the story to be just like, I don't know, for lack of a better term, tied up, or a happy ending, so to speak. You're more interested in the unraveling of thought, of threads, of these types of things. And yet you're a writer, and the standard form of the written word up until what, like 2 decades ago maybe, is the book. Um, and that, has its own framework, right? The covers, the spine. Um, so, you know, I guess my question is, right, if poetry and prose are the diptych that you're fashioning this project out of, how do you see them approaching harmony? How do you see them, this idea or these ideas at odds with each other? And like, why in the hell would you be a writer if you're you know, trying to unravel, so to speak, or displace yourself in such a way? Like, there are obvious answers here, but I'm like trying to push you like beyond those obvious answers.
Yeah. Here's one. In terms of opportunities, I grew up in a rural space. My teachers were hit or miss. Most of them, blessedly, were great. I have an art teacher, or had an art teacher through uh, most of my years, K through, uh, I guess, ninth grade, when my art teacher let me know specifically that I could quit fucking trying because the state of Illinois didn't require me to turn up to this class anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, uh, which I, in your sense, have thought out a lot in different ways. So it might have been a feeling that I lacked that talent, but I had an interest in the medium. I think that's a simple answer. I think I have a lot of interest in music. It's sort of, like Paul Desmond says this thing sort of famously about somebody asked him about, his wanting to be a novelist as a young man. He says, yeah, every novelist wants to be a musician. And I think maybe it's a little bit of that. But on top of all of that, right, like, I think a lot about, here's my sort of historical mind coming in, of the modern era being a sort of era of industrialization and mechanization of operations, and art, in contrast, trying to uplift the individual, especially the novel is trying to uplift the individual. And I think after the world wars, increasingly urbanized, increasingly technologized America has to come to terms with the grand narratives of people, and like large scale movements of people and diasporas of people and patterns of people, right? Uh, there's something about the way that we talk about anything from race to sexuality to, that becomes about an individual identity that has a preformed taxonomy about it, right? And that belies some of the actual human weirdness that happens, but um, because most of us don't live in communities where we're never going to experience the outside world, or we're at least going to experience the outside world through digital space that'll introduce us to, it's hard to not notice that many of our idiosyncrasies are in fact highly like conforming to a certain kind of social behavior. Um, so I think we end up having to write, like, today, our, Ingrid Wensler, who is our fiction editor, and I were talking about Alejo Carpentier, who wrote this phenomenal book called The Shadow and the Harp. And it's trying to look back at, happens to be Indigenous Peoples Day 2020 and Christopher Columbus Day. And it's looking at that book, Columbus himself as a character, and a moment when he's almost canonized by the Catholic Church. And it's, Carpentier was a musicologist, and he thought a lot about music, and he's got a really strange way of approaching that book. And it opens up into, this Pope thinking out whether or not to canonize Christopher Columbus for doubling the number of people in the known world and therefore doubling the number of saved souls. And then Columbus thinking out his own like shitbaggery. And then like this odd morality play at the end of the book where Columbus doesn't get canonized and he realizes that he's not excluded from all of the terrible things that might be said about him. And it's this fascinating kind of approach to dealing with the reality of being an individual, but also being an individual that has to deal with the consequences of these large modern historical narratives. And I think that in some ways, modernity as an artistic technique pulled poetry out and said, this is poetry, this is very exact poetry, right? Like, this is where we're going to put it. This is what the novel is. This is building the individual, right? Like Picasso gets into, right, like is the kind of peak of that moment, gets into cubism and breaking down images in new ways. And eventually we just get color and paint from, like, you know, de Kooning and Rothko and Pollock, and different ways of introducing those things. I think for me, recognizing how that kind of like segmentation starts to put people into different spaces. I'm really interested in the postmodern world of art bringing some of the weirdness back, and seeing sort of what I can do by pulling from other arts that sort of inspire me humanly, and dealing with different voices and different spaces and how they kind of come together and create strange human moments that go beyond the definable. I think I find folks like Carpentier, I'm probably saying that wrong, my Spanish is atrocious, but to be really inspiring as writers. And I think it's that, right? It's this way of looking at from pulling in those other arts and saying, okay, I'm going to put this into this thing. It's a little like alchemy. It's like that. I don't think the prose for me in poetry are in contrast. I really dig like Mallarmé, you know. I like I really like you know, thinking about sort of Rimbaud and some of those weirder moments. I like W.S. Merwin's sort of like prose poetics. You know, I don't know. I think I'm interested in that place where they meet and they open up and they just do what they have to do, and they create new ways of seeing. And I like to use a buzzword, that kind of liminal space at the intersection of prose and poetry. And I like to see those things coming together and crossing. I think it helps me recede from the feeling of being mechanized, or resist that feeling of being mechanized. And so I'm excited about that.
Excellent. Well, we hope you have enjoyed meeting our editors, and that you have watched this long, because we've had a great time having this conversation. Next week, we will come back with an all new interview, not one of the editors. It will be a surprise. And we thank you for your time. Thank you, Adam, for joining us today.
Matthew, thank you, everyone.
All right. Until next time, goodbye.